stories rise whispering.
Welcome back, favourite souls.
The echoes from the lone.
Settle yourself. Breathe slow. And let the room dim around you until the shadows soften and the air grows still enough that you can hear the quiet pulse of your own breath. Before we step into the dark, a small ritual of our own. If these stories find you and linger with you long after the episode ends, remember to like and share and subscribe. Not for the numbers, but to help these tales travel further, to reach others who walk the same crooked paths through folklore and fear. Now we turn our attention to the mountains. The old mountains, the Appalachian spine, where the ridges rise like the backs of sleeping beasts. And in those stories, walk a figure carved from bone and hunger, a witch or spectre or something that remembers being both. A creature who wears a caribou skull, though no caribou have ever walked these mountains. A figure who calls from the tree line in a voice shaped like your own. A figure who waits for the lonely, the ones who think they came to the mountains for quiet. They call her the Bone Lady. And tonight, she walks with us. Elias had not meant to stay long in the mountains, only long enough to outrun the noise in his own head. The kind of noise that follows you from room to room and street to street and from one sleepless night into the next, until the only solution seems to be distance from people and obligations and from a version of yourself that others expect you to be. The cabin he rented sat deep in the pines, so deep that the road leading to it narrowed into a single lane of packed dirt, so deep that the sky itself seemed to shrink into a thin strip of pale grey between the branches. And the cabin crouched in a clearing like something that had been abandoned by the world and left to rot in its own memories. Its roof sagging, its porch bowed, and its windows clouded with the residue of years spent watching things it couldn't speak of. The forests pressed close around it, the pines tall and thin and strangely contorted, and the air smelled of wet bark and cold stone. And the silence was thick, not peaceful but expectant. The kind of silence that feels like a breath held just for you. He told himself he'd come for the quiet, for the solitude. He told himself many things. But the mountains had their own ideas. First night passed in a restless haze. The darkness so complete it felt thick enough to touch, thick enough to swallow sound and hide anything that wished to move unseen. He woke several times with a sensation that someone had been standing just outside that window, close enough that their breath should have fogged the glass, and the boards should have creaked beneath their weight, but when he looked there was nothing but his own reflection. By morning frost had settled over the clearing, and it was in that frost that he found the footprints. Long and narrow impressions that sank deeper than they should have. They led from the tree line to the porch and stopped. They didn't turn back or wander off, they just ended. Elias crouched down to examine them, and the cold bit into his skin. And the prints were just wrong. They were too long to be human and too narrow for a bear and too deep to be a deer. And the spacing suggested a gait that was slow and deliberate. The gait of something that moved with the confidence of a predator. He told himself it was an animal. He told himself the frost had distorted the shape. He told himself many things. But the prince returned the next morning, and the next, and the next, always leading from the trees and always stopping at the porch. And the forest seemed to lean in closer each day, the branches knitting together overhead like ribs closing around a trapped animal. It was on the fourth night he heard the first call, a long, low sound drifting through the trees, rising and falling like breath, like a sigh, like a voice trying to remember how to speak after years of silence. It slid between the trees with a fluidity that made his skin crawl, and the sound shaped almost like his name but stretched too thin, as though spoken through a mouth that had forgotten how to form human words. Elias backed into the cabin and shut the door, and the calling stopped. But the forest didn't feel empty. It felt attentive. He had heard the stories, of course, everyone who grew up within 100 miles of these mountains had. The Bone Lady, the witch, the specter, the law, a figure who wore a caribou skull. The bone bleached white and impossibly old, the antlers branching like dead trees, each tine sharp enough to pierce the dark. Some say she was a woman who lived too long in the mountains, her bones hollowed out by hunger and filled with something that wasn't human. Some say she was the spirit of a woman who had died in the winter, her body found stripped clean, her skull missing. And some say she was a mimic, a law, a thing that called out in the voices of the lost. But all the stories agree on one thing. She comes for those who are alone. The fifth night was when he saw her. The moon was thin, the sky clouded, and the forest was a single mass of shifting black. He had been sitting at the table, trying to read, when he felt the air change. A pressure and a heaviness and a coldness that seeped into the marrow of his bones. He looked towards the window, and she stood at the edge of the clearing, wearing a caribou skull that gleamed faintly in the moonlight, the empty eye sockets fixed on the cabin. Her body draped in something that might once have been cloth or hide, but now hung in long, tattered strips that swayed gently, though the air was still. And her limbs were wrong. They were jointed wrong, bending in ways that suggested she had once been human, but had forgotten how to move like one. Her fingers were thin and too many, tapering into points that glistened faintly. She didn't move or speak, she just watched. Elias blinked, and she was gone. But the cold remained, sinking into the floorboards, into the walls, into his bones. And the next night the scratching began. Soft at first, like branches brushing against the wood, and then louder and slower, more deliberate. A long, dragging scrape that moved along the outside of the cabin, circling it, tracing its shape. And Elias sat in the centre of the room, with every light on, his hands shaking uncontrollably. And the scratching stopped at the front door, and a single knock followed. Elias held his breath and dared move. Another knock. He waited until dawn before he opened that door, and the footprints were back. Deeper this time, closer together, as though whatever had made them had been standing very still. And on the eighth night she called again. This time the voice was clearer, almost human, and it came from the tree line, and then from the porch, and then from just outside the window. Elias pressed his hands over his ears, but the voice slid beneath them, curling into his mind like a serpent, whispering his name with a tenderness, whispering promises that made his stomach twist. He felt himself stand, felt himself walk towards the door, and felt his hand reach for the latch. He didn't want to open it, but something in him did. Something frightened. Something that recognized the Bone Lady not as a stranger, but as a story his blood has always known. He managed to stop himself at the last moment, slamming the bolt shut, and the voice fell silent. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the center of the cabin with every light burning, every window covered, and every door locked. And the forest was silent. Too silent. And then a sound. But not the scratching or the knocking or the calling, but like something heavy being dragged across the porch. And he froze as the dragging stopped at the front door. A long pause and then a whisper. But not from outside the door or from the window. Inside. Behind him. He turned and found the Bane lady stood in the corner of the room. Her antlers scraped the ceiling and her skull gleamed white. Her body was a tangle of bone and hide and something that might once have been human. Her presence filled the room like a sickness, like a hunger, like a promise. She didn't move or speak. She simply watched him with the empty sockets of the skull she wore. He opened his mouth to scream, and the Bone Lady tilted her head just as the lights went out. If you're still with me, listener, breathe. Slowly, deeply. Let the room around you settle back. The Bone Lady is one of those Appalachian figures who lingers in the spaces between story and warning, between folklore and fear, between the living and whatever waits just beyond the tree line. She is the reminder that the mountains are older than us, hungrier than us, and far less forgiving. So as you step back into your evening, keep your lights low, your footsteps soft, and your windows closed tight. For the forest is quiet, but quiet does not always mean empty. The mountains did not speak of Elias after that night, not in any way a person could hear, not in a way that could be written down or passed along in the tidy shape of a warning. But the forest changed. Subtly at first, and then with a certainty that suggested the land itself had swallowed something it couldn't quite digest. The clearing where the cabin stood grew quieter, the birds avoiding it, the deer skirting round the edges, and the wind even refusing to pass through. The trees leaned in a little more each day, their branches knitting together overhead until the sky became a thin, reluctant grey of ribbon, and the ground beneath them grew soft, as though something beneath the soil had begun to shift. The cabin remained standing, though it looked different now. Leaner, darker, as though the wood had absorbed something it couldn't release, as though the walls had been listening too closely for too long. and had finally learned the wrong kind of silence. The windows clouded over from the inside, but not with condensation, but with something that looked like breath dried into the glass. And faint smudges shaped like fingers trailed downwards, as though someone had pressed their hands against the panes in the dark and waited for an answer that never came. People in town spoke of the place less and less, not out of fear, but out of a kind of instinctive avoidance. The way animals skirt a patch of forest. The woman at the general store stopped renting the cabin out entirely, though she never said why, only shook her head when asked and muttered something about the mountains keeping what they're owed. The old men who gathered outside the diner in the mornings stopped telling stories about the bone lady. Not because they no longer believed those stories, but because belief had become unnecessary. The mountains have reminded them that some stories do not need to be spoken to be true. And yet, despite the silence, despite the avoidance, and despite the way the forest seemed to hold its breath whenever anyone walked too close, people still notice things. Small things. Things that made the hair on the back of the neck rise. Hikers reported hearing footsteps behind them on the trail, always stopping when they turn around. Campers woke in the night to the sound of something brushing against their tents. A slow, dragging sound like fingers tracing the fabric. Hunters found long, narrow footprints in the frost, leading away from a tree line towards an old cabin, deeper than they should have been, as though something impossibly heavy had stood there for a very long time. And sometimes, only sometimes, someone would claim to have seen a figure standing between the trees at dusk, tall and still, crowned with antlers. They caught the last light of the sun like shards of bone. And they always described the same thing. A skull too white to be natural, too old to be new, too clean to have been found in the wild, and a body draped in tatters that moved without wind, and fingers that hung too long and too thin. But no one ever saw her move. She was always simply there, and then not. The forest grew darker as winter approached, the nights stretching long, the cold settling into the soil, and the clearing around the cabin froze early, the frost forming in strange patterns, spirals, loops, shapes that looked almost like footprints, but not quite, as though something had walked there without fully touching the ground. And some nights, if you stood at the edge of the clearing and listened closely, you could hear something beneath the wind. A low, rhythmic sound, not quite a voice, not quite a breath, but something that rose and fell with a cadence that felt almost familiar, almost human, almost like a name being spoken. And if you stayed too long, if you lingered after the sun dipped below the ridge, you might feel the forest shift around you, the silence deepening into something that feels like presence pressing against your skin. You might feel watched, feel wanted. You might feel chosen. Because the bone lady does not take quickly. She does not chase and she does not rush. She waits. She waits for the lonely. She waits for the grieving. She waits for the ones who come to the mountains seeking quiet and find instead the kind of silence that listens back. And somewhere beneath the cabin floorboards, beneath the frostbitten soil, beneath the roots that twist like veins through the earth, something shifts, like a body turning in sleep, like a hunger waking, like a story remembering it's not finished. The mountains keep what they're owed, and the Bone Lady keeps what she takes. And if you ever find yourself walking alone through the Appalachian dark, if you ever hear your name carried on a breath that is not wind, if you ever see a figure standing between the trees, do not answer, do not look, do not stop, because she remembers Elias. She remembers you, and she's still hungry. Thank you for walking with me through the dark. Until next time, wayward souls, may your paths stay clear and your names stay uncalled.